Well, hello and welcome to week 4. One of the central things we'll be looking at this week is the Great Awakening. And what historians call the First Great Awakening can best be described as a revitalization of religious piety that swept through the American colonies between the 1730s and the 1770s. That revival was part of a much broader movement, an evangelical upsurge taking place simultaneously on the other side of the Atlantic, most notably in England, Scotland, and Germany. And in all these Protestant cultures during the middle decades of the 18th century, a new age of faith rose to counter the currents of the Age of Enlightenment, to reaffirm the view that being truly religious meant trusting the heart rather than the head, prizing feelings more than thinking, and relying on biblical revelation rather than human reason. The earliest manifestations of the American phase of this phenomenon, the beginnings of the First Great Awakening, appeared among Presbyterians in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. This was led by the Tennant family, Reverend William Tennant, a Scots-Irish immigrant, and his 4 sons, all clergymen. The Presbyterians not only initiated religious revivals in those colonies during the 1730s, but also established a seminary to train clergymen whose fervid, heartfelt preaching would bring sinners to experience evangelical conversion. Originally known as the Log College, it's better known today as Princeton University. So religious enthusiasm quickly spread from the Presbyterians of the middle colonies to the Congregationalists and Baptists of New England. And so by the 1740s, the clergymen of these churches were conducting revivals throughout the region using the same strategy that had contributed to the success of the Tennants. So there were emotionally charged sermons, all the more powerful because they were delivered extemporaneously. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards evoked vivid, terrifying images of the utter corruption of human nature and the terrors awaiting the unrepentant in hell. And so you probably have heard of Edwards' famous description of the sinner as a loathsome spider suspended by a slender thread over a pit of seething brimstone. In his best-known sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. If you don't know this sermon and you have a chance to check it out, you could certainly find it online, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. It's one of Edwards' most famous, if not the most famous sermon. So what I'd like to do with the primary resources is to first start back into a revival, a smaller awakening, if you will, a revival that took place in the Connecticut River Valley in 1735 to 1736. This was a reaction to the decline in piety and a laxity of morals within the Congregational churches of New England. And itinerant evangelizing generated renewed enthusiasm and spread the message of revival throughout the churches of Connecticut. And although the Great Awakening stimulated dramatic conversions and an increase in church membership, it also provoked conflicts and division within the established church. So in the fall of 1740, George Whitefield, who was then 26 years old, only 26 years old, had stirred emotions throughout England toward the seaboard of the Connecticut Valley and amplified the spirit of the awakening. And so Nathan Cole, and this is your first primary resource, went to hear George Whitefield speak in Connecticut. And Cole was a carpenter and a farmer, and his writings offer you an opportunity to study the impact of the Great Awakening on the life and thought of a layman. You'll see that Cole had quite an emotional response to the preachings of George Whitefield, and Whitefield was indeed a key player in the awakening. Another interesting fact is that Connecticut was also the home of Jonathan Edwards, and so it's very might well be that the revival in Connecticut was part of the tinder, if you will, that lit the flames of the First Great Awakening. So there was, you'll see in many writings of this time, there's a noted decline in piety that's often noted upon in many of the primary resources. So the second generation of Puritans were becoming more lax, and there was a great concern about this laxity. And this stemmed in part from economic changes and political transformations, and also Enlightenment rationalism, and we'll talk a little more about that later in the lecture here. And so all of that really fed into what we now call the Great Awakening. And then these series of religious revivals resulted in doctrinal changes and influenced social and political thought. So it was definitely a time of great change. I have included a short video which covers the 7 Years' War as well as the Great Awakening, just to help you with the context. I think it's useful. I know it's useful for you to understand the French and Indian Wars, also known as the 7-Year Wars, as an important event leading up to the American Revolution. And so just to help you contextualize, I have put a short video in. I've used John Green's crash course video. I like his videos. I think they're short, to the point, and I also think they're entertaining. So please let me know if it's something that you like. I'll certainly try to include more if that's something that's helpful to you. And once again, I'm turning to Linford Fisher so that we can incorporate the position of Native Americans during this time. He has a journal article that I've uploaded to Blackboard, and you have a link there so that you can read a little bit more about the Native American perspective. The primary sources also include the Flushing Remonstrance. This was a petition to the Director General of New Netherlands, in which 30 residents of the small settlement at Flushing, which would eventually become a neighborhood in New York, but at that time was part of New Netherland. And this petition requested an exemption to a ban on Quaker worship. Some historians consider this a precursor to the United States Constitution's provision on freedom of religion in the Bill of Rights. So I think it's really important for you to take a look at this and think about the impact that it possibly had on our Constitution. Kenneth T. Jackson is a professor of history at Columbia University, and he identifies the Flushing Remonstrance as remarkable for these reasons. He says, number one, it articulated a fundamental right that is as basic to American freedom as any other. Number two, he says the authors backed up their words with actions by sending it to an official who was not known for tolerance. So that's quite remarkable. And also in number three, they stood up for others, articulating a principle that was of little discernible benefit to themselves. So arguing for the exemption to the ban on Quaker worship really wasn't something that would help themselves, but it was more something that they believed in, that kind of this idea of freedom of religion on a larger scale. So go ahead and read that, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I've also included readings on Jewish life in colonial America. Important to incorporate that, and as you'll see, there's quite a long history there. And I also want you to keep in mind what's going on outside of the East Coast. So I know a lot of this focus is on New England and the Eastern Seaboard, but I want you to keep in mind that North America, of course, at this time is a very large continent, and there's much going on. I have a primary source from the readings of a Roman Catholic Spanish priest, and this was Junipero Serra. He was a driving force in the Spanish conquest and colonization of what is now the state of California. So it's important to read what he had to say, I think, because he has become one of those names that we still talk about today. And I have included a little video at the end of the resources on Blackboard so you can follow along. There's a video that goes into his life in a little more depth. So it's another important event that's happening is the transatlantic slave trade, bringing African religion, in particular Islam, to America. And so you'll read a primary source on a Muslim merchant as he recalls his capture and enslavement. So I think in terms of looking at Enlightenment thought and how that contributed to the American Revolution and the founding of the American Republic, I think your textbook does a good job covering that. So I'll leave it up to you to read about that in the textbook, looking at Enlightenment thought and the fear of tyranny, both civil and ecclesiastic. So read that carefully. But I also want to have you focus on the significance of the Dutch Republic and the influence it had on the founding of the American Republic. So I've included a link to a separate account in your primary sources. So in addition to reading your textbook, you can also read that piece on the Dutch Republic. So I hope that really helps you think a little bit differently about Enlightenment thought and the origins. I hope you have enjoyed David Hall's book and it's helped you add to your own picture of colonial religion in New England. You will be writing, if you haven't done so already, a précis for that, which is just a short summary of the book. And I've detailed my expectations for that précis in a separate discussion blog post. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to ask directly on that post or send me an email. And you'll start to read Thomas Kidd, American Christians in Islam, Evangelical Culture and Muslims. I found this book very interesting. I read it for a class myself probably 4 or 5 years ago. And I think has significance for us today. And looking at the history of evangelical opinion in terms of Muslims and Islam, I think it's not only interesting, it's very important for us to understand. So that wraps up my lecture for this week. I know it was very brief. Just wanted to summarize some of the primary sources and let you know the direction that we're heading in this week. I do have a couple of videos, like I said, for you to check out in addition to the readings. So if you have any questions regarding the material for this week, don't hesitate to contact me. And I just wish you have a great week, and I will talk to you soon.